It was a regular afternoon in Brighton Park, a neighborhood that had always felt like home to Rachel Harris and her daughter, Emma. The kind of place where everyone knew each other by name, and the local playground had seen countless joyful moments. Emma, a bright-eyed 7-year-old with a wild imagination, was no exception. She had spent what felt like hours on the swings that day, her laughter ringing through the air as she soared higher and higher. Rachel, sitting on the park bench with her book, could hardly contain her smile as she watched her daughter's carefree joy. But in a blink, that peaceful moment would shatter, and the world around them would transform into something unrecognizable. The tranquility of the park, the laughter of children, and the chirping of birds were suddenly drowned out by the sharp, unsettling sound of heavy footsteps and the commanding voice of a police officer. I can still picture it clearly. The officer, Mark Taylor, a man who seemed to have too much authority and not enough understanding, approached Emma. He was tall, white, and his uniform was as stiff as his expression. Emma had slowed down from her high swings and was now playing with the sand, when he suddenly appeared, his hand reaching for her arm with an unsettling force. I remember Rachel standing up from the bench, the chill creeping into her bones as she saw Emma stiffen, her face contorted in confusion and fear. It's hard to explain how fast everything happened. One moment, it was an innocent afternoon in the park, and the next, Rachel was rushing toward her daughter. "Hey, what are you doing?" Rachel called out, her voice trembling, a mix of disbelief and protective instinct rising in her chest. The officer's face didn't change. "Your daughter is not supposed to be here alone," Officer Taylor said gruffly, though Emma had been playing in the same spot for hours. "But she's not alone. I'm right here," Rachel protested, her voice getting louder now. The officer didn't respond. Instead, he tightened his grip on Emma's arm and pulled her toward him. Rachel reached out instinctively, trying to intervene, trying to pull Emma away from the officer's grasp. But instead of releasing her, Officer Taylor shoved her back with more force than necessary, sending her stumbling backward. The crowd, which had been scattered around the park, began to notice. It didn't take long for a few phones to appear, cameras pointed directly at the unfolding scene. The park, which had been so full of life just moments before, felt eerily silent now. The children's laughter had vanished, and all that remained was the tense atmosphere of something completely wrong happening before everyone's eyes. "Let go of my daughter," Rachel screamed, her voice cracking, a raw plea for justice. But the officer didn't seem to care. He just continued to grip Emma's arm, pulling her toward the sidewalk, as if she were some criminal to be arrested. Emma, frightened beyond reason, started to cry. The sight of her small, innocent face, distorted by fear, was more than Rachel could bear. She pushed forward again, her mother's heart waging a war against the helplessness she felt in that moment. But just as Rachel reached out to grab Emma, she froze in her tracks. Dwayne Johnson had appeared out of nowhere, tall, powerful, and with a calmness that radiated from him like a shield against the chaos. He stood a few feet away. At first, Rachel wasn't sure who he was. She'd heard of him. Of course, everyone had, but this wasn't the moment for distractions. But as he moved closer, the crowd began to part around him. It wasn't his fame that stood out, but the energy he carried with him. There was an undeniable calmness in his approach, the kind of composure that makes you trust someone even in the most unpredictable situations. Dwayne's eyes locked with the officer's, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. "I think you need to let her go," Dwayne said quietly, his voice even but firm. There was no hesitation, no fear. Just the clear assertion of someone who understood his own strength. Officer Taylor took a step back, his grip still on Emma's arm. Dwayne stood his ground, his eyes unwavering as he repeated, "Let her go." Rachel, still in shock, watched as the officer, despite his earlier resistance, seemed to falter. It was a strange kind of power, the power of quiet authority. Of confidence without violence. Dwayne's mere presence had begun to shift the entire dynamic of the scene. And then, slowly, reluctantly, Officer Taylor released Emma. Rachel's heart nearly stopped as she reached for her daughter, pulling her into her arms. Emma, still trembling, clung to her mother like she was the only safety in the world. I remember the moment so clearly, the relief flooding through Rachel as she whispered to Emma, telling her everything was going to be okay. But it wasn't. Not yet. Emma's cries, muffled by her mother's arms, were still a painful reminder of how easily an innocent moment could be distorted. The crowd, which had been quietly observing, started to murmur. Phones were still raised, capturing every moment of the encounter. Some were watching with wide eyes. Others were stepping forward, showing support for Rachel and Emma. But it was Dwayne, the man who had stepped in without hesitation, who had caused the first shift in the atmosphere, as if his strength, calmness, and integrity had begun to seep into the situation like a healing balm. And though the immediate danger had passed, Rachel could already feel something stirring in her chest. Something bigger than just protecting her daughter. It was a feeling she couldn't quite name yet. But she knew, deep down, that the storm wasn't over. There was something much more profound happening here. Something that would change everything for them. Something that could never be undone. It wasn't just about a mother protecting her child. It was about justice. It was about right and wrong. And somewhere in the midst of all of this, Rachel realized she was no longer just a mother trying to protect her daughter. She was part of something much bigger, something that was only just beginning to unfold. The scene in the park had been more than an incident. It had been a moment of truth. And the questions that it raised about power, about fear, about what we owe to each other were only beginning to surface. The chaos of the moment began to settle. But it felt like a heavy fog still hung in the air. The tension was palpable. And for a long while, Rachel couldn't find the words to express what she was feeling. She just held Emma close, feeling the small body trembling in her arms, and tried to calm her, despite the storm of emotions raging within herself. But something else was happening around them, something that couldn't be ignored. The crowd, who had been silent witnesses up until now, was beginning to murmur among themselves. And then, there was Dwayne Johnson. I still don't know how to describe the shift that came over the park the moment he stepped into that situation. It wasn't just the physical presence of the man, though he was undeniably large and imposing, it was the quiet confidence he carried with him. The kind of assurance that can silence a room just by walking into it. His movements were deliberate, calm, almost like he knew exactly what needed to be done, even though the chaos around him seemed to be spiraling out of control. As the officer, Mark Taylor, began to retreat, still fuming with irritation, Dwayne moved towards him without fear or hesitation. His gaze locked with Taylor's, the tension between the two men crackling in the air like electricity. "What's going on here?" Dwayne's voice, smooth but firm, cut through the murmurs of the crowd. There was no aggression in his tone, just the directness of a person who would not tolerate injustice. He wasn't raising his voice, but there was a weight behind each word, a calm authority that was impossible to ignore. Officer Taylor, still holding on to his sense of power, looked up at Dwayne and made a show of standing his ground. "I'm handling this," he snapped. His voice edged with irritation, but there was something in his eyes, something uncertain. Dwayne didn't flinch. He didn't need to argue or make a spectacle of things. He didn't have to shout or throw his weight around. He simply stood there, and his presence alone seemed to demand respect. "You're not handling it, man," Dwayne said, his tone not unkind, but firm. "You don't have the right to treat her like that." His words were simple, but they held a truth that was undeniable. The crowd, now gathering around, seemed to hold its breath, watching to see what would happen next. It was hard to tell how the officer was processing it all. On the one hand, He was clearly trying to maintain control of the situation. But on the other, Dwayne's mere presence was unsettling him. Maybe it was because Dwayne wasn't afraid to stand up to authority, not out of anger, but out of something else entirely. Empathy. Maybe. The understanding that power is only effective when it's used responsibly. It was as if Dwayne wasn't just confronting Officer Taylor, but the very idea of misused authority. "Let her go," Dwayne repeated, each word dripping with calm insistence. It was a simple request. But the way he said it, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that he meant it. At that moment, something shifted in Officer Taylor's demeanor. His body language, which had been stiff and defensive, suddenly seemed to falter. His grip on Emma's arm loosened, his face reddening as if he realized he was in the wrong. For a split second, his eyes flicked toward the crowd of onlookers who had been recording the entire scene. The realization that this moment was being witnessed by so many people seemed to affect him. And then, with one final look of resignation, Officer Taylor released Emma's arm. The relief that washed over Rachel was indescribable. She quickly pulled Emma into her arms, shielding her from the officer, as if to protect her from the echoes of fear that still lingered in the air. Emma buried her face in Rachel's chest, clinging to her like she was the only safety left in the world. Rachel could feel the little body shaking, and her heart broke as she whispered reassurances, trying to comfort her, even though she herself was still trembling from the intensity of the moment. "Thank you," Rachel whispered to Dwayne, her voice a soft blend of gratitude and disbelief. She hadn't expected anyone to step in, let alone someone like him. She wasn't sure if she was more grateful for his presence or for the fact that he had been able to de-escalate the situation without resorting to anger or aggression. Dwayne simply nodded, his expression calm. But there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes as he looked down at Emma. "No one should have to go through something like that," he said quietly. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of someone who knew that injustice wasn't something to just ignore. "Take care of your daughter," he added, before turning back toward the officer, who was now retreating into the crowd. Rachel watched as Dwayne moved away, surrounded by a few onlookers who began to murmur their own thanks and praises for what he had done. But Dwayne, despite the attention, remained humble. He wasn't there for the recognition, he was there to make sure that Emma, that Rachel, would be safe. The moment passed, but in a way, it felt like everything had changed. And as the crowd began to disperse, Rachel realized something profound. Sometimes, the right kind of strength comes from simply showing up. The situation was far from over. But that moment, when Dwayne had stood up for what was right, when he had stepped into a tense moment with nothing but empathy and authority, was the turning point. For Rachel, for Emma, and for everyone who had witnessed it. It was the moment when they began to see the world differently. It wasn't just about the police officer's actions anymore. It was about the way people could come together in a time of crisis, driven not by anger or vengeance, but by love, understanding, and the courage to stand up for what was right. The park, now quiet after the storm of tension had passed, felt strangely still. The distant hum of traffic from the street was the only sound that seemed to make sense in this moment. But for Rachel, the calm was deceptive. Her heart still raced, her thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. Emma, though no longer crying, clung to her mother, her small hands gripping tightly as if she feared being pulled away again. Rachel wanted to believe that everything was over, that they were safe. But deep down, something told her that what had just happened was only the beginning. As she held Emma close, trying to steady her own breathing, she saw Officer Mark Taylor retreating, his face flushed with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. He had retreated, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The way he had looked at her when he released Emma, there was something in his eyes, something that suggested this wouldn't be the last time they'd cross paths. And sure enough, within moments, the situation was about to escalate again. From the corner of her eye, Rachel saw Dwayne talking to a few onlookers. Still calm. Still composed. His stature was imposing. But there was an undeniable warmth in his demeanor. A sense of reassurance that calmed the chaos that had been surrounding them just moments before. But the peace was short-lived. Officer Taylor, having regained his bearings, suddenly turned back toward the scene, his steps purposeful and filled with frustration. The crowd, which had started to disperse, froze. Even Dwayne paused, sensing the shift. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" Dwayne called out, his voice cutting through the air, firm but without the aggression that had been present in Officer Taylor's earlier tone. The officer didn't reply immediately. Instead, he marched toward the center of the park, clearly intent on asserting his authority once again. His anger was evident in his stiff posture, in the way his jaw clenched. The crowd watched in silence, some of them holding their breath, knowing that the situation was teetering dangerously close to another conflict. "Enough, man." Dwayne's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. "You need to back off before this gets worse." For a moment, the officer hesitated. His eyes shifted from Dwayne to Rachel, then back again, his face growing redder with each passing second. There was no way to mistake it, he was looking for an excuse to escalate. Maybe it was the humiliation of being confronted in front of so many people. Maybe it was the lingering frustration that his authority had been challenged. Whatever it was clear that he wasn't about to let it go without a fight. "I'm doing my job," Officer Taylor said, his voice rising now, trying to regain control of the situation. This woman was interfering with an official duty. Stop. Dwayne cut him off, his voice firm, unyielding. He stepped forward, his presence towering over the officer. "You were wrong. And you know it. You're not going to intimidate anyone here today. Not me. Not her. Not anyone." At this point, Officer Karen Miller, who had been watching from the sidelines, finally stepped in. She was a senior officer, and the contrast between her composed demeanor and Officer Taylor's increasingly erratic behavior couldn't have been more apparent. "Mark," she said calmly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "That's enough." Rachel felt a rush of relief as Officer Miller intervened. There was a quiet authority in her tone, the kind that seemed to instantly de-escalate the situation. Rachel could see that Officer Miller was not going to let things get out of hand. The crowd began to shift, some moving closer, others stepping back, all sensing that the balance had tipped. "Everyone, please remain calm," Officer Miller continued, addressing both the crowd and her colleague. "This situation is going to be investigated, and the appropriate steps will be taken." Rachel could feel the weight of those words. Investigation. It meant that something would come of this, that Officer Taylor's actions wouldn't just disappear. It was a glimmer of hope, a reminder that justice had a way of finding its path, even when it seemed lost. But even as Officer Miller spoke, Rachel couldn't shake the lingering sense of dread. She looked down at Emma, who was now resting her head on Rachel's shoulder, her eyes wide and still filled with fear. The world around them had changed in an instant. And though the immediate danger had passed, the emotional toll of what had happened would take far longer to heal. The aftermath of this encounter wasn't just about the officer's actions, it was about everything that it represented. It was about the struggle for justice, the fight against fear, and the way a single moment could expose deep-seated inequalities. It was about Rachel realizing that this wasn't just about protecting her daughter anymore, it was about standing up for something much bigger. Something that would echo far beyond the boundaries of that park. As the officers prepared to leave, Dwayne made his way over to Rachel and Emma once again. His presence was a quiet strength, offering a sense of security even as the weight of the world felt heavier than ever. "You're going to be okay," he reassured Rachel. His words genuine, heartfelt. "You've got a lot of people who care about you now. Don't let this moment define you. Let it drive you to fight for what's right." Rachel looked up at Dwayne, her heart full of gratitude and newfound strength. She didn't know what the future would hold. But one thing was clear: this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The tension had not fully lifted. But there was a noticeable shift in the air as the officers began to leave. Officer Miller had taken charge. And the crowd, which had once been on edge, now began to disperse slowly, some still whispering about what had just transpired. The buzz of conversation was filled with confusion, empathy, and a sense of shared disbelief. It was as if everyone present, whether they had witnessed the moment firsthand or had only heard bits of it, had been shaken in some way. Rachel stood there for a moment, her arms around Emma, trying to process everything that had just happened. Emma, her little face still pale, clung to her mother, as though she was afraid to let go. Rachel could feel her daughter's small body trembling, and the pit in her stomach deepened. Emma had been through something no child should ever experience, something that might scar her in ways that couldn't be seen on the surface. The thought made Rachel's chest tighten, but she didn't let it show. Not now. Not in front of Emma. But even though the immediate danger had passed, Rachel knew the road ahead would be difficult. They couldn't just forget about this incident. It was a moment that had to be dealt with, processed, and understood. And then, like a steady anchor in the storm, Dwayne was there again. He approached them slowly, his presence still a comforting and reassuring one. "Is she okay?" he asked, his voice gentle but filled with concern. Rachel nodded, her voice soft. "She will be. Eventually. But it's hard. She's scared. She didn't deserve any of this." Dwayne nodded, understanding. "No one deserves that." His eyes softened as he glanced down at Emma, who was still clinging to her mother. "It's not just about the physical danger. It's the fear. The trauma. That's what really gets to you." Rachel could see that he understood in a way that others didn't. He wasn't just offering words of sympathy, he was speaking from a place of deep understanding. Maybe it was because he had witnessed countless acts of injustice. But there was something in his eyes that told her he had been through his own struggles. He wasn't just a bystander in this moment, he was part of something bigger. A man who stood up for what was right no matter the cost. "I don't know how to thank you," Rachel said quietly, still struggling to find the right words. "You didn't have to do anything. But you stepped in anyway. You made it stop." Dwayne shook his head, a modest smile playing on his lips. "I didn't do anything that anyone else wouldn't have done if they had the chance. You're stronger than you think. Rachel. Don't let this break you." The words, simple as they were, seemed to settle into Rachel's heart. She realized then that Dwayne wasn't just offering reassurance for the moment, he was helping her to see a bigger truth. He was showing her that she wasn't alone in this, that she had the power to keep going, to fight for what was right for her daughter and for herself. Just then, Officer Miller walked over to them. She had been speaking to the other officers, but now she turned her attention back to Rachel. "Mrs. Palmer," she began, her voice steady but sympathetic. "I know this is difficult, but I want you to know that this situation will be fully investigated. The actions of Officer Taylor will be reviewed, and we'll make sure that everything is handled appropriately." Rachel nodded, though she felt a quiet bitterness in her chest. She appreciated the words, but the reality of what had happened still lingered in the pit of her stomach. The justice she hoped for wasn't going to come easily. There would be legal battles, public scrutiny, and a long, painful process ahead. But at least, she thought, something was being done. "I'll be in touch with you soon," Officer Miller said, as she turned and walked back toward the officers. The crowd, which had been hovering around, seemed to thin out, each person slowly retreating into their own world. Rachel stood there for a moment longer, her mind racing. It felt like the world had shifted beneath her, and she wasn't sure if she was still standing on solid ground. "Mom," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "Am I going to be okay?" Rachel's heart broke. The words, spoken so softly and with such innocent concern, shattered something inside of her. She wanted to tell Emma that everything would be fine, that nothing like this would ever happen again. But deep down, Rachel knew that wasn't a promise she could keep. But what she could promise, what she would promise, was that they would face this together. That Emma would not go through this alone. That Rachel would always be there, no matter what. "We're going to be okay, sweetheart," Rachel whispered back, her voice a little stronger now. "We'll get through this together. And we'll make sure no one forgets what happened today." Dwayne had stepped away by now, allowing them a moment of peace. But Rachel could still feel his presence. Still feel the steady strength he had given her when everything had felt so uncertain. It wasn't just about the confrontation anymore, it was about what came next. It was about the decisions Rachel would make in the coming days. The path that she would choose for herself and Emma. And she knew, deep down, that this wasn't just her fight, it was a fight for all those who had ever been wronged. For every person who had ever faced injustice without a voice. It wasn't going to be easy, but with Emma by her side, and with people like Dwayne supporting them, Rachel felt ready to stand up. Ready to make sure that, in the end, things would change. Because some battles, the hardest ones, were worth fighting for. The days that followed the incident felt like a blur. At first, everything seemed to settle back into a routine. Rachel took Emma to school, made dinner, helped with homework, and tried her best to keep life as normal as possible. But the peace was fragile, and it didn't take long before the storm of media attention began to roll in. The first thing Rachel noticed was the phone call from the news station. A reporter, polite yet insistent, wanted her to comment on what had happened in the park. Rachel declined. She didn't feel ready to talk about it. Not yet. Not while her daughter was still afraid. Still processing everything that had occurred. But the media wasn't so easily deterred. Within hours, the story had gone viral. The video of Officer Taylor grabbing Emma and the subsequent confrontation with Dwayne had been shared across every social platform, news outlet, and blog. Some people saw Dwayne as a hero, a man who stepped in when others would have stayed silent. But others, they saw it differently. Public stunt or heroism. One headline read, "Dwayne Johnson's interference, a step too far," another questioned. The reactions were mixed. Some hailed him as a protector, a father who couldn't stand to watch an injustice unfold. Others, though, criticized his involvement, claiming that his actions had escalated the situation rather than diffusing it. The debate raged on, split between those who viewed Dwayne's interference as courageous and those who saw it as an overstep. For Rachel, the media coverage was overwhelming. Her face, her daughter's face, was everywhere. News outlets dissected every frame of the video, scrutinizing Dwayne's every word, every gesture, and analyzing the officer's movements. Rachel couldn't escape it. Her phone rang constantly, with messages from well-meaning friends and family, reporters, and even strangers. They all had something to say. Some wanted her opinion. Others wanted her to share her side of the story. But Rachel wasn't sure what that side was anymore. It wasn't just the attention on Dwayne that made Rachel uneasy, it was the scrutiny of her own role in the incident. She found herself replaying the moments in the park over and over again, questioning if she could have done something differently. Was there a way she could have handled the officer's aggression without making things worse? Could she have protected Emma without causing such a spectacle? But those thoughts, as much as they haunted her, weren't the most painful part. It was the way the media portrayed her. They labeled her as the mother who intervened or the woman caught up in the chaos, but the headlines rarely gave her the depth she felt. They focused on the drama of the moment, the confrontation, the tension, the emotions, but failed to capture what it had really meant for her and Emma. She wasn't just some passive character in a viral video. She was a mother, doing everything she could to protect her daughter. But the constant public scrutiny made it feel as though her actions were reduced to sound bites, headlines, and opinions. Emma, 2. Was affected. Schoolmates who had never spoken to her before started to ask questions. Their voices filled with curiosity, some of them even showing her the viral video. They wanted to know why the officer had grabbed her, why the man had stepped in, and if she was okay. The questions were too much for Emma to handle, and Rachel could see the strain on her face. She had once been a little girl who loved playing at the park, who believed in fairness and safety, but now, she was marked by fear, uncertainty, and a public life she hadn't chosen. "Mom," Emma said one afternoon, as they sat together on the couch, watching the latest news segment. "Why are they saying all those things about you? Why do they keep talking about that day?" Rachel paused, her heart aching. She reached for her daughter's hand, trying to comfort her. "People don't always understand everything, sweetie," she said softly. "They see what's in front of them, but they don't always know the whole story." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I don't want to be in the story anymore, Mom. I just want things to go back to normal." Rachel's throat tightened, but she forced a smile. "I know, baby. I know. But sometimes, when things like this happen, it's not about what we want. It's about what we can do to make sure it doesn't happen again, to make sure you're safe." It was a difficult conversation, one Rachel hadn't been prepared for, but she knew it was only the beginning of a much harder journey ahead. And though the public reaction hurt, there was still something inside her that knew they couldn't back down now. Dwayne, in the meantime, stayed true to his word. He reached out to Rachel regularly, checking in on her and Emma, offering his support. Though he had become a media sensation, his focus remained on helping them heal. He knew the battle wasn't over. The real fight wasn't about the headlines or the public's opinion, it was about the deep scars left on Emma, and the quiet strength Rachel needed to find within herself to protect her daughter from the trauma that was now part of their story. For Rachel, the media attention was an overwhelming force. But it was also a reminder. People were watching. People cared. And as much as it felt like her family was under a microscope, the reality was that their voices, her voice, had the potential to spark something bigger than the media frenzy. It could spark change. And that, she realized, was worth fighting for. The days turned into weeks, and the media attention began to fade. But for Rachel and Emma, the aftermath of that fateful day at the park was far from over. The emotional toll was profound, and Rachel found herself wrestling with the weight of it all. Emma's fears didn't dissipate overnight, nor did Rachel's worries about what their future would look like after such a traumatic event. But amidst the pain, something deeper began to stir, a quiet resolve that they weren't going to let this define them. The investigation into Officer Taylor's actions moved forward, though it felt slow and cumbersome. Officer Miller, the lead officer on the scene, had assured Rachel that everything would be handled with thoroughness and care. Still, there were moments when Rachel found herself questioning if the system could really deliver the justice they needed. She had seen enough stories of people falling through the cracks, of perpetrators slipping through the legal system unscathed. The doubt crept into her thoughts, but Rachel pushed it aside. She had to believe in the process, not just for herself, but for Emma too. They needed to see this through. In the meantime, Rachel and Emma began therapy, each session bringing new layers of healing and understanding. At first, Emma was reluctant to speak about what had happened. The words caught in her throat, as though speaking about the incident would somehow make it real again. But slowly, she began to open up, sharing her fears and anxieties with her therapist. Rachel, too, had her own moments of vulnerability, the guilt she carried, wondering if there was something more she could have done, haunted her in ways she couldn't fully express. But through the guidance of her therapist, she began to recognize that she wasn't to blame for what happened. They had been victims of a system that too often failed to protect its most vulnerable. The legal proceedings, meanwhile, were slowly gaining momentum. Officer Taylor had been placed on administrative leave while the investigation continued. The charges against him were serious misconduct, abuse of power, and unjustified use of force. Dwayne had already testified, recounting the events he had witnessed with remarkable clarity. His voice had become a beacon of support, not only for Rachel and Emma but for all those who had watched the video and seen the injustice unfold. As the trial date drew closer, Rachel felt a mixture of dread and hope. The process was long, and each day felt like a battle. But there was something empowering about taking this step, about standing up and demanding accountability. It wasn't just about winning a case, it was about making a statement that what had happened to Emma, to her, would not be forgotten. It was about sending a message that no one, especially children, should ever feel unsafe in a place that was supposed to be free of fear. The courtroom was tense on the day of the trial. The defense attempted to discredit Dwayne, questioning his involvement and suggesting that he had acted out of line. They painted Rachel as an overly protective mother who had overreacted, accusing her of exaggerating the situation. But Dwayne's testimony remained unwavering, and the evidence presented by the prosecution was irrefutable. As the final arguments were made, Rachel could feel the weight of every word spoken, every argument presented. This wasn't just a fight for justice, it was a fight for dignity, for the right to raise her child in a world where they weren't afraid of the very people meant to protect them. When the verdict came in, Rachel felt a wave of relief wash over her. Officer Taylor was found guilty of misconduct. The sense of justice, though bittersweet, gave Rachel and Emma the closure they had desperately needed. The moment was marked with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition of their strength, their resilience, and the long road they had traveled together. The healing didn't end there. Emma still had moments of fear, and Rachel still carried the weight of everything they had endured. But now, they were not defined by the incident, they were defined by their ability to rise above it. They were a family, stronger for having gone through the storm together. As they stood in the aftermath of the trial, Rachel knew that their journey wasn't over. There would still be challenges ahead, new obstacles to face and lessons to learn. But with Emma by her side, and with the support of people like Dwayne who had stepped up when it mattered most, Rachel was ready. They had been tested, and they had emerged stronger. And no matter what came next, they would face it together. The scars might never fully fade, but Rachel had learned something profound in the process. Healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about moving forward, one step at a time, with love, resilience, and hope.